Welcome to Calling All Stations for our regular look at the world of transport. I'm Christian Wolmar in Italy, and with me is Mark Walker in Peterborough. Mark, I think we've got a lot on our plate today.
Good afternoon, Christian from Peterborough in the UK, and I hope you're having a wonderful time in Italy. Now, yes, we're going to make today's edition of Calling All Stations a special on the many aspects of reform and change that we're seeing in the railways in Great Britain at present. But we're starting off with something of an exclusive for Calling All Stations.
Yes, indeed. And I've been talking to a lot of people around the industry, as you know, and I come up with a rather remarkable story, which is that the Department for Transport wants to stop the train operators from providing Wi-Fi to passengers. I think I'll say that again. The Department for Transport actually wants to reduce the quality of the train service by saying to passengers, sorry, you can't access Wi-Fi via the train. You can only do it via your own devices. And of course, we all know that trains have tunnels, or rather railways have tunnels, bridges, God knows what else, dark spots where the internet is very poor. And yet that's what the Department for Transport want to do. And I came across this story, talked to various people about it, and I got confirmation from the Department for Transport that in order to cut costs and save money, they want to reduce this service and stop the train operators from providing Wi-Fi on their trains. And so I rang up the Department for Transport and I got a statement from them which said that, well, Wi-Fi isn't very important for passengers, that actually people don't use it very much. And they quoted a Transport Focus survey, and their quote, not I don't think Transport Focus is, their quote is, passenger surveys consistently show that on-train Wi-Fi is low on their list of priorities. So it is only right that we work with operators and review whether the current service delivers the best value for money. And the survey they quoted from Transport Focus, they say, well, people found that value for money for ticket prices, reliability, punctuality, personal security, all those other things were more important than Wi-Fi. And therefore, why actually continue spending the money that it costs to provide? They say that in many cases, the on-train Wi-Fi equipment is now in need of replacement or upgrade, since the first equipment was installed in 2015 with corresponding implications for the commercial case. So in other words, it's all about saving money. But I think there's a bit of a story about why all this equipment dates to 2015, with which you're familiar, aren't you?
Yes, I believe there was a package of investment back in around 2015, 2016, which was an occasion when, due to some underperformance by Network Rail during that particular control period, a £50 million fine was levied on Network Rail. And that was recycled back into what were described as passenger benefits. And it funded the rollout of the Wi-Fi, passenger Wi-Fi, on those parts of the rail commuter network which didn't already have Wi-Fi installed. So it was seen then as a really tangible passenger benefit, as a kind of compensation for other areas of performance where customers had been let down by the rail industry. So it's a really quite extraordinary development. And I'm not surprised you had to say it there, Christian, 2 or 3 times over for it to even sound plausible that the Department for Transport would want to now turn off this passenger benefit.
So, yeah, so in other words, we, the passengers and taxpayers, have actually paid for this already, because that was a fine to Network Rail, which then Network Rail decided to spend on improving Wi-Fi and commuter services. Now, it's funny you should mention commuter services, because a third part of the statement that they gave me said, in mitigation, many non-intercity journeys are relatively short durations, and the usage of the on-train Wi-Fi has typically been low in preference to passengers using their mobile phone directly without connecting to the on-train Wi-Fi. Well, yes, but of course, many passengers don't want to use up their data in that way, or they might not be able to get connection to their phone provider. And indeed, it's part of the service, as obviously in 2016, they recognized it was part of the service. And now they're saying, oh, well, nobody much uses it. And of course, I'm sure you'll understand this, Mark. The big thing, why this gets me really kind of quite angry, is that we're trying to get people to use the railways. We're trying to attract the commuters back onto it. And what do people like doing on trains? They like to get their laptops out and their phones out and bash away a few emails or whatever their work they have to do. And if they can't get that reliably on the train, they might then consider using their car, don't you think?
Exactly. People are making marginal choices about which transport mode to use, and anything that you do which reduces that marginal attractiveness of the rail service must be distinctly questionable from any kind of marketing or commercial point of view. But also, as I understand the position, Christian, because the connectivity that's provided by the mobile kind of Wi-Fi type systems on trains is now so important operationally, the department is not proposing to turn off the systems entirely. They're simply proposing to turn off the systems insofar as they provide a passenger benefit in the form of Wi-Fi connectivity. So those systems which they claim are obsolete will still be there and still functioning, but simply be inaccessible to the passengers who've paid for them.
And they'll probably still need to be renewed when the time comes. So
absolutely,
it won't save much capital cost. They'll save a bit of data usage. But I think Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, is an accountant, and I think this is a typical accountant's view of the world. That there's a cost somewhere. We don't really know if it kind of does anything. So let's cut that cost. And anybody who knows anything about the railways, goes on any train at all, will see that everybody is on their devices and they want a continuous signal. And as I've emphasized already, there's tunnels and dead spots, and I think even leaving King's Cross, actually going north, there's a dead spot for a few minutes, kind of before you get to Welling, I think, and as well as, of course, being a tunnel there, and that's just repeated kind of in many places around the network, and it's so illustrative of the wrong type of thinking, of the idea that everything to do with the railway is a cost. You can't do anything about that. So all you're trying to do is save costs and not actually trying to attract more people onto it so that you actually reduce the amount of subsidy. It's such a narrow view of the world. I can't really believe they'll see this through once this becomes public. And clearly it hasn't yet. And, this is our exclusive.
Absolutely. And let's hope that the rail operators, those commercial organisations, will be brave enough to speak up on behalf of their customers and of their industry and defend this very important aspect of the quality of passenger rail services in Great Britain.
Well, I have put through a call to the rail delivery group, but they said they didn't know anything about it and they'd come back to me in a couple of days. I'm sure they're deeply embarrassed about this. And I'm sure that the train operating companies, if they were ever to regain any part of the revenue risk, in other words, if they were to start kind of being reliant on boosting numbers using the railways in order to get their income, I suspect they would be dead against this. But anyway, let's hope that by making a fuss about it, people will stop this ridiculous measure.
They seek it here, they seek it there, they seek it everywhere. Christian, what is the status of Great British Railways?
Well, it was dead. It was alive. it was then dead again, and maybe it's alive again. Just to recap, so GBR was created by Boris Johnson, and following the Grant Shapps Williams report, Boris Johnson was very enthusiastic about the idea, and it was going to be an all singing, all dancing affair, kind of running the railways, taking over Network Rail, letting out contracts, and so on. And then it seemed to go all very quiet, and nothing much was happening after the departure of Grant Shapps. And it seemed that GBR was dead and it wasn't going to actually happen. And then it got revived when the new Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, who was apparently reluctant about the idea initially, didn't really want a kind of state-owned organisation responsible for the railways, but realised that it probably was necessary, accepted the idea of it, as I say, somewhat reluctantly, and so did his number two Rail Minister, Hugh Merriman. And so then we got lots of information about the fact that, yes, this is going ahead. It's going to be an organisation that will reform the fares. It will be responsible for Network Rail. It will let out contracts and so on. And in this very podcast, in the last edition, we did an interview with Aneet Chandarana, who is the lead director of Great British Railways Transition Team. God, that's a mouthful. And he was clearly a bit worried about whether there would be legislation. And clearly expressed some doubts about whether there would be time in the King's speech to do it, and was actually very keen that there should be legislation, because without the legislation, Great British Railways cannot actually let out the contracts. They would still have to be done by the Department of Transport, and that would be very messy. And then we see in a report in the Times, and followed up in other newspapers a couple of days ago, that Great British Railways was dead again, and that it was not going to happen, that there'd be no time in the King's speech, that it would have be quietly shelved. But then we get a counter report from the Department of Transport saying, no, it's not dead, it's alive. Of course, it has to battle for other legislation, and we're not sure there'll be legislation, but Great British Railways is alive and breathing, and we're proceeding with plans to reform the railways. Although it didn't actually say in that statement that it definitely would be through the agency of Great British Railways. It just said that reform is happening. It didn't really express or give any details as to how that would happen. So, where are we, Mark?
I mean, one of the things I find most frustrating about all of this is the cover story that's deployed of the lack of parliamentary time, because that really is complete nonsense. And governments can always find time for the legislation that they really want to see enacted. And I think they're treating people as fools to try to use that defensive line. And in fact, this piece of legislation would probably be quite modest compared to the railway legislation of 1993, which created much of the present structure. So what we're really coming back to, Christian, is this question of whether the government collectively in the UK wants to proceed with this particular reform model, or it doesn't. And it seems pretty clear that there's still an argument going on as to whether they really do.
Yes, and I mean, they've said that, well, we don't need legislation, for example, to reform the fare system. But, they could do this at any time. I mean,
where's the reform then, is my question. Where is it?
Absolutely. Yes. Where is what is the reform that they're trying to do? If older listeners will remember that this all started 5 years ago with the May 2018 timetable, which was a massive kind of a cock up is the only word I think one can say to it, because the timetable that they were trying to bring about and had agreed with the train operators could not be delivered by Network Rail, and nobody had kind of sorted out that out. So they said, well, we need an integrated railway that brings the infrastructure in together with the train operators, something that I've always argued is totally necessary, and most railway people do. But we're nowhere nearer that than we were 5 years ago. And all the stuff that they could do around the edges, like fares reform, like kind of trying to simplify the relations between the operators and Network Rail, trying to bring it more together under one roof, getting them to talk to each other. None of that seems to have happened. And do you know that Great British Railways, as of the end of last year, had spent more than £50 million in creating itself? And to be honest, we haven't seen much for that money.
No, and indeed, I think there was a parliamentary answer this week that said the budget allocated for the reform programme is somewhere in the region of £200 million. So we could get quite a lot of other improvements to the network for £200 million, couldn't we, rather than being spent in this way. I also find it astonishing that we're told 2 years after the publication of the reform proposals that all of the clever people working on this have still not managed to draw up a single profit and loss account for the rail industry, which they said was one of the requirements for the reform process, to sort of be able to clearly understand what money goes into the industry in terms of subsidies and fare box, and what money goes out of it in terms of costs. And I would have thought that there is probably enough financial management software in the world to have been able to have done that by now.
Indeed, that was specifically mentioned by Mark Harper in his now famous Bradshaw lecture, and that was now 3 months ago. Anybody with any nous should be able to work out how to do that and how to bring the two bits together.
I think you could do it with Post-it notes, actually, Christian.
Absolutely, and a whiteboard. And the whole point is, I think that links up with our first story about the Wi-Fi, because if somebody was in control of the profit and loss account and looked at it as a whole, they would be able to make decisions like over Wi-Fi, over passenger improvements, and they just seem despite this vast amounts of money. I mean, it's probably costing £500,000 or £1 million a week in terms of drawing up this Great British Railways, and we see nothing coming from it. So I'm at a loss to understand how they can be so slow. I'm sure if we got, you and I know quite a lot of very good people in the rail industry. If we got half a dozen of them together in a room for a week, I'm sure we could come up with a pretty good blueprint of what the railways ought to look like.
There's a challenge for us. Perhaps something we ought to be picking up. I think one area that where there is some positivity, though, there are a number, to be fair. One is that there is very strong evidence of passengers returning to the railways back to pre-pandemic levels, or even higher than pre-pandemic levels in some cases. There's also tremendous growth of leisure travel for rail. But it's interesting that we see in Scotland, in particular, some quite dynamic initiatives there to promote rail growth.
Yes, it's exactly the sort of thing that you and I have personally discussed in the past, is to try and implement some basic fares that were easily commercially advertisable and comprehensible for the public. So in Scotland, they're now saying that if you join their over 50 club, you can then travel anywhere in Scotland for just £15. And return by the end of June for the same price. And now that's exactly what you need in terms of bringing people back into the rails, or getting them to come to the railways for the first time. I mean, one of the ideas that I think you've had, for example, is to say, well, why not cap all fares at £100? Just any journey within the UK could be £100 at the absolute most. I think that sort of initiative, which would be very easy to publicise, very easy to demonstrate the simplicity of it, would reap dividends and probably pay for itself. I mean, in Germany, they've now got this €49 monthly pass, which has been implemented following their initial kind of €9 emergency pass. But so for €49, you can travel pretty much anywhere in Germany, both on local and regional and national
It's astonishing,
networks.
isn't it? Absolutely astonishing offer there.
I know. And yet we do not have the imagination to do that.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, we spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about the problems of Britain's railways. And I've been spending 2 or 3 weeks in Italy, in Umbria. And there's a story that of the local railway route that illustrates that our problems are not unique. There's this line that runs between the town of Perugia and San Sepolcro, which is about kind of 40 miles. And it's a little single track line separate from the rest of the Italian rail network, funded by the local Umbrian region. And it used to be electrified, but somehow, I don't know, the electrical equipment became redundant. And so it has little 2-car diesel trains that kind of go up and down. It would be a very useful railway if it had more frequent trains and so on. But anyway, it's a nice ride into the major town, Perugia. And a few years ago, I attended a ceremony because I happened to be here at the time when they were introducing new electric trains, and they put up some new catenary, some new electric wires, and they brought in these new trains, and there's about 4 or 5 of them. And this was about 7 or 8 years ago. And those trains have never run. They sit at a station in the middle of the line called Umbertide, and they just gather lots of graffiti on them. They are sort of, streamlined 3-car diesel trains electric trains that would clearly kind of go up and down the line much faster than the terrible little diesels. And yet somehow they've never been put into use, despite the fact that there's new catenary, new trains, but somehow they've never operated. And I can't get to the bottom of why, but I can't imagine that happening in the UK somehow, even despite the dysfunctional nature of our railways.
Calling All Stations with Christian Wolmar is a Cogit Armus Limited production. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @AllStationsPod.